before we get into the second memoir, let's talk about John's. It's on page 203.
Let's see. All the way down. Let's see. John's. Okay.
This has a great transition where it uses a rat that John Wilkes Booth kicks after murdering Abraham Lincoln, and it floats into the future and travels 100 years, as it's stated. This is also a great memoir in how many different transitions it has and gets into so many different ideas. And it also contains, along with Mark Rowland's Philosopher and the Wolf, the best evocation of Plato's cave that I've read.
Mm. Yeah.
So
it's also got my sonnet, Where Ignorant Armies Clash, and I think is that the end of a Browning poem? Not Browning. Who's the one who did Dover Beach? That's either the end of Matthew Arnold or...
Matthew Arnold, yes.
Yeah, it's the end of a Matthew Arnold poem, Where Ignorant Armies Clash. This is actually, I think, one of my greatest sonnets. I would put that part in. Well, again, something that only breaks my top 100 is still going to be better than anyone else's. But yeah, that's a great sonnet, and it's one that, you know, when I read it again. But anyway.
Since we were talking about the difference between a 94 and a 95, what do you think constitutes the difference between some of these upper tier poems? Say, Where Ignorant Armies Clash, and it's hard to compare, say, Where Ignorant Armies Clash to, you know, American Imperium or The Bridge or Song of Myself. That's a silly comparison. But something of a similar length, or something of a page length, like Siamese Reflection, Where Ignorant Armies Clash, I would certainly put Siamese Reflection ahead of it, not only because it does more, but also because it's longer. But there's certain sonnets of yours, like, say, The Passings, that I may argue in favor of Where Ignorant Armies Clash. What do you think are some of the devices that constitute the difference between those things?
I mean,
and do you think it can be categorized in a way?
It would have to sort of be on a poem-by-poem correlation. You know, if I look, you know, there are things that can make, for example, some of my poems on criminals, serial killers, great, that are going to be utterly absent in Where Ignorant Armies Clash. I have a poem, I forget the name, it's got a long title, that I saw a magazine article, I think in like Discover magazine or Natural History magazine, about the last...
As I recall it, I don't remember the title either.
The last birds killed on an island in the South Atlantic before they went extinct or whatnot. And, you know, so it's hard to compare because theme sometimes matters to the greatness. If I was to write a poem, for example, about the poem that I wrote about the last bird being killed on this South Atlantic island, part of the emotional resonance of that comes from knowing that. So you'd have to look that up. But when you read something like The Passings, you don't have to look something up. So to a certain extent, some of the great poems or sonnets or whatnot, or even some of the great books are conditional. If you read A Norwegian in the Family, when you read that, they're going to be celebrity names that you're not going to know of. And someone in 500 years is certainly not going to realize they're a celebrity. So they'd have to look that up to get some of it, whatnot. But a lot of that doesn't matter because...
In a way, that's a comment, though, on the passing and the ephemera of the day. That's actually an excellent use of allusions, too, because it says things without actually saying them. So all these celebrity names, unless they are an enduring figure, have an Ozymandian fate awaiting them.
Yeah. So I mean, it just depends on there's so many factors at play. You'd have to do sort of a one-on-one correspondence. Why is this poem better than that poem? Some of it, like I said, there is subjectivity. I've never denied that subjectivity exists. If you took like Stevens on Safari versus The Passings, you could make arguments for either of those poems being greater. If you're someone who likes a little bit more mystery, you know, what is looking at, I mean, even though it says Stevens on Safari, there's a deep strain of Rilke in that poem. So this is more obviously indebted to a knowledge of poetry and great poems of the past. Whereas The Passings, you don't even have to recognize the shout outs to Carl Sagan's Cosmos or anything. There is just, and you don't even have to recognize that there are aspects that are personal to me. So that poem is more out there, and it's actually going more for, say, an emotional gut punch. I've talked about how the last line reuses Philip Larkin's ending from High Windows and Robert Frost's from Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. So there's also pulling in other poems there in a totally different way than I use it in the Stevens on Safari, which references Stevens and also has a strain of Rilke in it. So which is a greater usage, for example, of that? You could argue either way. As long as they're great, it doesn't really matter to me. I'm always striving to do something great. The spy book that I'm working on right now, I want it to be a great novel, but I can tell you it's great in a totally different way than Vincetti Brothers or Tumbleweeds or A Norwegian in the Family or my Western book was. And you know, when you read A Norwegian in the Family, that's basically a dark comedy. You can't. It's got dramatic moments in it, and there's lots of drama in it. But that book is essentially a comedy. The spy book I'm doing is not a comedy, although there are some comic moments in it. So again, how do you compare Doctor Strangelove to 2001: A Space Odyssey? People would argue that one or the other is Kubrick's greatest film.